In the counterproductive, toxic, and caustic nature of the gender wars, constantly the vitriol is aimed at black women, and I took the misogynist to task. I spoke about how red pill and misogynistic platforms, they primarily attack black women and make black women the target of all of their critiques. But I'd be remiss if I do not talk about the misandrous, if I do not talk about the other racist platforms that are being produced from non-black people, from black women, that are specifically aimed at black men. Throughout the 245-year history of this nation, black men have often been made the pariah of American culture and society. Certain stereotypes about black men being prone to violence, being prone to being sexual deviants, these things have been perpetuated throughout American culture. Now what you're seeing in 2023 in this counterproductive gender war is that many of these platforms are growing and monetizing their content by perpetuating the same racist stereotypes that you would see in the 1915 film Birth of a Nation, by perpetuating the same stereotypes that you would see on a Stormfront forum, by perpetuating the same stereotypes that you would hear from a Michael Savage, that you would have heard from a Rush Limbaugh. These are the things that you see young black content creators, black women alarmingly using their platforms to perpetuate against black men, and they're trying to mask this as a critique, something that's going to be progressive for the community. But it's still as counterproductive and divisive as a lot of the red pill misogynistic content that's being put out there. All of the problems within the black community can solely be placed on the shoulders of black men, because black men lack initiative, they lack leadership, they're not going to college, they're not getting degrees. And even if you study history, whether you're looking in the antebellum period or you're looking at the advent of the transatlantic slave trade, this all happened because black men weren't brave, they lacked leadership, they have been innately indolent. These are things that have been perpetuated by a lot of these misandrous platforms. Now you have to ask yourself, where do you get this sort of rhetoric from? Is this true? Does history support these ideas? Or are you learning this from being indoctrinated through a racist system and rhetoric that isn't really found on historical research? But more so, it's this innate need to juxtapose one another. It's a need, whether you're looking at the misogynists and the red pill people in this gender war, this horrible gender war. It's this need to blame black women. But what we're seeing as a rebuttal is a lot of these misandrous platforms, these women, they're coming up with this content, and all of the issues of the black community are solely based on the black men. And so there's no need to have discourse that's going to lead towards resolution. There's no need to have discourse that's going to produce some sort of an outcome that's going to be beneficial for everyone. What we do is we get caught up in this rhetoric and these polemical discussions, and we get caught up in trying to prove our point, even if our points are predicated on misinformation, even if our points are predicated and built on the foundation of slavery and racist rhetoric and pseudoscience and scientific racism. We don't even care. As long as we can make a point and we can disrespect and denigrate the other, that's all that matters. The resolution isn't what's important. It's getting our rhetoric out there. It's monetizing our platforms, but still trying to masquerade as some sort of astute person or intellectual, or saying that our platform is here because we're going to talk about issues that's going on with black men. Or our platform is here because we want to speak about issues that are going on with black women. And it's all bullshit, because neither one of these parties truly care about the community. But when you look at history, you have to study the need to emasculate black men. Where does this come from? Why is it, if you look at this country's history, there's this dichotomy? So when you look at the period before the Emancipation Proclamation, when you're looking at the antebellum South and you're looking at the slave period, you get into the Jim Crow period. What are the certain caricatures of black men that you're seeing? You're seeing a few, but primarily, either you get this mythos of this hyper-violent black man that is prone to sexual deviancy, that is prone to attacking white women. This is the image that you get. Or you get the image of the docile black man that's like a child in an adult's body. Because you either have to have an extreme. You have to have the extreme of the extra violent black man, or you have to have the extreme of this docile creature that is so dumb and clumsy that they really can't even operate off of their own self-agency. It's a systemic need to produce this dichotomy, if you will, of the image of black men. So either you're dealing with this violent criminal, this sexually predatory person, or either you're dealing with an imbecile, somebody that's an ignoramus, somebody that is not capable of self-agency. So there's a benefit systemically to producing this image of black men. And if we want to look for the origin or the catalyst, if you will, of the need to construct this sort of image, you have to go back and you have to look at slavery. This counterproductive and pseudoscientific paradigm that we all adhere to and we all acquiesce to now, this pseudoscientific paradigm of race, is a construct that really arose over the last 400 years. This construct, this idea that you're going to look and judge and look for innate characteristics based upon phenotype, based upon pigmentation, and to a degree, based upon culture. These are the things that fuel the need to justify why you can have barbaric treatment of certain humans. When you look at slave castles, and for example, the Elmina slave castle, when you go there in the dungeons of the slave castles, people will often talk about how you had to clean out the bodies of aborted fetuses. You know, aborted fetuses were there, women that died in childbirth, rats eating on the corpses of other human beings. So for you as a human being to see this going on, there has to be a pseudoscience that can arise to justify this idea. But nonetheless, when people are looking at slavery or the transatlantic slave trade, and you're looking at different places in the Western Hemisphere that incorporated enslaved Africans into their societies, they actually knew where they wanted to incorporate certain Africans from. So for example, in a lot of the South Carolina colonies and places that would become the Geechee and the Gullah communities, there was an emphasis on taking enslaved Africans from the Windward Coast. Why? They already had knowledge of rice production and indigo. These are things that they were aware of. You had certain Fulani people that were aware of cattle herding. So enslaved Africans actually came to the country with medicinal knowledge, farming knowledge, literature as well. For a brief period in Georgia and South Carolina, you saw Arabic written on slave letters. There were Muslims that were brought in that were enslaved and captured. So we weren't a monochromatic people that were just brought in arbitrarily. So there were certain places that certain purchasers and enslaved people, they were looking to get human beings from. So this is important because certain African people, and all to a degree, were very rebellious. There were constant mutinies on slave ships. That's why slave ships had to be insured. If you look at somebody like a William Byrd II in Richmond, Virginia, he actually made a lot of his money off of insuring slave ships. So it was a big business. Slavery wasn't just profitable for the people that owned the human cargo, but it was also profitable for all of the ancillary businesses that would spring up around slavery as well. But with that being said, certain groups, specifically Igbo, the Igbo had a reputation for being rebellious, both Igbo men and Igbo women. But throughout the South and throughout parts of the Northeast even, there was trepidation on the part of slave owners on purchasing male Igbo enslaved Africans. So oftentimes people would sell their male Igbo slaves to Virginia. So if you go and you do a genealogy test and you look at the state of Virginia, a lot of African people, or a lot of black people within the state of Virginia can actually draw their lineage back to Igbo people. It was such an influx of Igbo men being put and sent to Virginia because they were known for mutiny. They were known for breaking and sabotaging equipment. They were known for poisoning people. And to a degree, they were also known for taking their own lives, for not trying to live in such an inhumane and barbaric. Igbo men were often made synonymous with rebellion. Igbo men were often made synonymous with revolution. This is why there was a fear around Igbo men and other groups from other parts of West and Central Africa as well. So in order to dampen the fears in potential purchasers, in order to dampen the fears in people that may have these enslaved people on their plantations, but also to heighten fears in those that will be part of what will become slave patrols, to actually violently put down any semblance of mutiny, any semblance of insurrection, you have to create this weird mythos around black men of either being indolent, lazy, idiotic, ignoramus, not capable of self-agency, or they're dangerous and they're hyper-violent. And you see with the Igbo, there was a reputation around them all up and down the East Coast, and once again, they were often sent to the Virginia colony. So one of the signs, or actually one of the events, that just shows the deep rebellion of the Igbo is in 1803. So in 1803, on the York vessel off of the coast of South Carolina, you had a Igbo uprising on that vessel of over 75 captors. And so they actually overthrew the people on the ship. They were able to make it on land. They were led by a priest, most likely of Odinala. Odinala is an indigenous belief system of the Igbo and was practiced throughout southwestern Nigeria, where a lot of the Igbo Confederacy would have been. But the Igbo, instead of submitting to the turpitude and the barbarity of enslavement, they actually marched into a marsh and they drowned to death. A lot of the bodies were recovered, but this was not an uncommon thing. On certain slave ships, so when you read The Slave Ship by Marcus Rediker, he speaks about a different type of mutiny, a different type of rebelling, where people would jump into the water to actually escape enslavement. People would jump overboard. Now, this happened in certain instances, but one of the ways to stop that from happening, what ship captains will begin to do is that they would take people and they would show what would happen, what would be the punishment if you were to rebel in that capacity. So, for example, there was one ship that he spoke about, Marcus Rediker, in the book The Slave Ship. Please check that book out. But one of the instances, he spoke about a woman who was put on a rope, lowered in the water. People thought she was drowning, but she actually was, part of her was eaten off by a shark. This put fear in the people from jumping overboard again. But once again, one of the quotidian things that you see in a lot of these different capacities is that there's a need to nullify the strength, the leadership, the assertiveness of Black men in many of these different capacities. And this is carried on throughout this country's history, whether you're talking about in bondage, or whether you're talking about the Jim Crow epoch, or even now currently. There's an innate hatred of any sort of leadership or assertiveness or dominance that's exhibited by Black men. There's a need to kind of quell that and to wet that down. People do not like when Black men are full of themselves, when they are perceived as arrogant, dominant, outspoken. These things are, people really try to stop you from being there that way. There's a hatred against Black men that are outspoken. There's a hatred against Black men that truly are smart, intelligent, and know what they're talking about on certain subjects. But when you look at this country's history, you go back, the contradiction and the hypocrisy here, when you're studying American history or Western European history, or even parts of African history and antiquity, we speak about certain figures in history and we big them up and we revere them. When you're looking at William Wallace, and who led the Scots against the English in a form of rebellion because they did not want to deal with the tyranny of the English. When you're looking at Spartacus, that led the largest rebellion in Roman history, we read it with awe. There are movies made around Spartacus. Or even if you look at our country, our nation's history, when we didn't want to be under the boot of the English crown, and people were tired of what they were dealing with, in the English, in the British colonies under the English, and there was an impetus to push and fight, and which led us to the American Revolution. There's a celebratory mind frame that we look at with these different figures in history. But then when you look at the inhumane bondage that occurred against people of African descent, whether it's the United States, whether it's Haiti or Haiti, whether it's Jamaica, whether it's Cuba, whether it's Brazil, when we look at that and we see rebellions, we don't want to talk about it. We want to depict these people as being animalistic. We want to depict these people as being crazed murderers. We want to depict these people in ways that take their humanity away from them. But on the same token, we're looking at a William Wallace. We're looking at a Spartacus. We're looking at a Paul Revere. We're looking at George Washington and the leaders of the American Revolution, and we praise them and big them up. So why is it with one group we can acknowledge their humanity? We can acknowledge the need that there was one group of humans being oppressed. There was one group of humans that were being treated in a harsh and inhumane way, and they stood up for themselves. But then when you're looking at people of African descent, the need to recognize the humanity there, it goes away. The need to recognize that this is a group of humans that we're dealing with tortures and horrors on levels that we can't imagine, that we're trying to stand up for themselves. We do not acknowledge their humanity. And it makes us hypocritical in that capacity. And these are the different things, if you're looking at the slave trade, the domestic slave trade, these are things that went into producing these images that we have of black men, and a lot of the rhetoric and the ideas that we want to put out there to categorize black men in a negative light. These ideas didn't come innately from our community. These are things that we've learned from outside sources. These are things we learn from external factors, experiences, and different literature as well. But these are ideas, these are racist concepts against the character assassination of black men. Now, once again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have critical discourse. I'm not saying that we shouldn't try to lead or build towards some sort of resolution. And I'm not even saying that black men have not done many things that have not been productive for the community. I am not saying that black men do not exhibit misogyny against black women. I am not even saying that black men are not in positions where they exhibit a level of misogyny. They exhibit things that are emulative of a racist system within their own community. I'm not saying that at all. But what I am saying is, when you say things like black male babies should be aborted, how does that help the community as well? When you sit up and all you do is do character assassination, and you just look at black men as this monolith, as something to be attacked, as something to be hated, and you're calling yourself progressive, you're calling yourself an agent of change, you're calling yourself a mouthpiece for the black community, if you will, you're just as counterproductive as the red pill manosphere content creators in this so-called gender war. Once again, it's predicated and built upon trying to destroy the image and the integrity of black men. The need to create this mythos of black people, more specifically black men, as being innately dangerous is actually a pragmatic reason for this from an economic standpoint. If you're looking at today's economy and we were to analyze the institution of slavery, you're looking at a multi-billion-dollar industry. So don't only think about the slave owners, think about all of the ancillary businesses that begin to spring up around slavery that were actually able to profit from slavery as well. So when you're using pseudoscience and scientific racism, if you're using these images that are saying that black people are innately violent, that black men are innately sexual predators, that if they do not have the institution of slavery, they wouldn't know how to survive, they couldn't conduct themselves, they need the overseers, they need the slave owners. You do a few things when you put those images out there and those sorts of stereotypes. One, you instill fear of the masses of the dominant population, so it can actually get people on your side to keep this barbaric institution in place. But also, you're trying to protect a multi-billion-dollar industry that is responsible for sugar, that is responsible for tobacco, that is responsible for indigo. These different things, these different products that made their way all around the world. Sugar. These are things that had to be protected. These are entire industries that made so many different nations and people wealthy, whether you're talking about France. You look at cities like Richmond, Virginia, Liverpool, London, New York, places that became meccas of commerce due to the profit that was made from the slave trade. So it's not just about taking away the humanity of people. It is about that. But it's also about protecting the multi-billion-dollar industry that was in place at that time. It is said that on the eve of the Civil War, some of the richest people on planet Earth at that time, when you're looking at the 1850s, lived in the Mississippi Valley. Why is that? You're talking about something that was extremely lucrative, and it provided a source of free labor for this country for centuries, and allowed such a leisure class to arise and to allow one nation and several nations actually to become economic powerhouses. The American empire and Western hegemony could not and would not exist without slavery. This is something that economists and historians have pointed out in many different scholastic works, that when you're looking at the institution of slavery, that it basically set the foundation for our current monetary system. It said that in 1850, if you were to look at those on the net worth of those in bondage, so the total capital of those in bondage, it would have been about $4 billion at that particular time. So you're not just looking at, once again, the images that were produced is not just about taking away the humanity from people. You're looking at a huge industry that is invested in keeping a certain demographic of people in this particular position because it's making so much money, and people don't want to look at it from that aspect as well. So many different cities, different companies, insurance companies were able to arise. So you look at New York Life Insurance, they've told us New York Life Insurance has said that they got their start in slave policies. Out of the 1,000 first policies that they submitted, 399 of those were to insure slaves or slave owners. When you're looking at JP Morgan and their earlier predecessor banks, they would actually use enslaved people as collateral on loans. And then if the slave owner defaulted on the loan, they would actually come in and collect the slaves because the slave owner actually defaulted on the loan. So you're not just looking at an image that was constructed out of a hatred for black people, but there was a huge monetary incentive involved as well. So this concept of black men being dangerous, this also ties into the drug laws. It ties into the police system. As we know, our modern police system goes back to 1704 with the slave patrols. The slave patrols first started to track down and hunt enslaved Africans that tried to flee for freedom, that were trying to get away from the barbarity of the plantation. This is the origin of our modern law enforcement. After emancipation, this form of slave patrols was actually replaced by militias as well that did the same thing. They would try to stop black people from voting. They would try to stop black people from pursuing any sort of means of autonomy. You know, this is where you get that from. Once again, the images that a lot of our content creators spew now, it goes back to this particular epoch in our nation's history. We have the mythos of this innate danger that's ever present in black people, more specifically black men. We have slave laws, black codes as well. So these things actually went into the criminalization of marijuana. So the origins of the criminalization of cannabis or marijuana in this country's history can actually be tied back to slavery, but more importantly, it can be tied back to the images that have been inculcated about black men in this country. The fervor to make cannabis or marijuana illegal, it really started to arise in this country after 1910. So after 1910 is when we see the end of the Mexican Revolution, and we start to see a lot of immigrants from Mexico coming. And what they bring with them is a plant that they would smoke that was referred to as marijuana. Some would argue that if you do the etymology of marijuana, it has a Nahuatl or an Aztec origin. Some people have argued that the origin was brought to the Western Hemisphere from people that from the people of the Congo as well. So it's actually a Congolese word. But nonetheless, this term marijuana was a term that was used to actually scare people when it came to the uses of marijuana. This was something that was frightening a lot of the white residents in Texas at the time. So if you look at the origin or the earliest anti-cannabis or anti-marijuana laws, you actually find them in places like El Paso and in towns or cities around the Mexican-U.S. border. But more importantly, you see people like Harry J. Anslinger, who was the head of the U.S. Department of Narcotics, and they're actually mimicking or parroting a lot of the racial rhetoric against black men and against black people, because one of the ideas around cannabis is that if it was used by black people, more specifically black men, it would cause a spike in criminal activity. It would cause a spike in degeneracy. And also one of the erroneous things, or one of the most seditious things, if you will, that was put out there against black men when it came to the uses of cannabis is that if black men use cannabis, it would cause them to want to go and sexually violate white women. So a lot of these things actually went into making cannabis illegal. So when you look at the laws that were put in place against cannabis in this country, it wasn't because of health reasons. It wasn't because it was dangerous to the population. But one of the primary reasons is that One, it could potentially make black men want to go out and sexually assault white women. And two, it was a fear, a xenophobia of these newly arrived immigrants into U.S. territory. The mythos of danger, it went into protecting the multi-billion-dollar industry of slavery at that particular epoch in our country's history. It also went into the criminalization of marijuana. It also went into fueling what became the prison industrial complex as well. These same images, these same stereotypes are things that you see black women content creators perpetuating against black men, and yet they're trying to masquerade themselves and their platforms as some sort of solution and resolution for the problems that are afflicting black people. But their primary target is aiming their vitriol at black men. There have been times where I've listened to black women that are content creators that consider themselves misandrous or they hate men, but when they say men, they primarily mean black men. And I've seen them say things like black men are nothing more than bullet bags. I've also seen them say things like black male babies should be aborted. If you find out that you're pregnant with a black male child, then you should go and you should get an abortion, because if you get an abortion of that black male child, it'll help the community. There are women that also call themselves divestors. So what they're saying is that black women should divest from black men, and that it's better off if they're dating non-black men. And so my argument against that, or against the divestors, if you will, is that you are using racist stereotypes. You're using ideas that you were taught within this society against an entire populace of black men. Once again, I say you cannot have this monochromatic view of black men and then lead that to make a decision such as divesting. Once again, I've always argued that race, the concept itself, is a pseudoscience. It's a social construct. It doesn't have any real validity in biology. It doesn't really have any real validity when you go into history further back than the past 500 years. But nonetheless, if you want to use that as your template for how you operate with mating and relationships, then you're going down a path of destruction. And you're going down a path that's going to lead you towards disappointment, because what you're doing, you're not looking at a human as a human. You're not looking at a person for their, for all of their idiosyncrasies, all of their nuance, all of their flaws, all of their good points, all of their shortcomings. You're looking at people in this square of being a white man or this square of being a black man. And you juxtapose those squares, and off of superficial views and off of views that are rooted in racism, you're going to make your determination upon that particular man. This is not to say that the black community and black men are not without problems, but going about it this way and using your platform to fuel hatred against black men, once again, a lot of the arguments are rooted in a racist society. A lot of the arguments are rooted in concepts that were created in this country during slavery. There was an argument that became popular about a year ago, and the argument was that straight black men are the white people of black people. And I'll repeat that again. The argument was that straight black men are the white people of black people. And the premise of this argument is that if you examine the black community, straight black men interface with the black community in the same ways that the institution of Eurocentrism or white supremacy interfaces with black America. Now, as I say, I always attack this concept of race. I attack it from the perspective of studying history. I attack it from the perspective of biology. So that's the first flaw in that argument. If you're going to say straight black men are the white people of black people, I mean, who are you talking about? Are you talking about people from Ireland? Are you talking about Italians? Are you talking about people from Greece? Are you talking about people from the Netherlands? I mean, I could get that granular on that particular argument. But more so than that, what people are trying to say is that straight black men operate within the black community in the capacity as a racist would, in the capacity of trying to oppress others. I can understand the argument, but it's erroneous and it's not true. Black men within the black community don't possess the institutions to actually oppress anyone and to stop anyone from getting access to things. And I know people are not going to like me for saying that, but it's just the truth. At best, you can have black men that may emulate certain tenets of racism, certain tenets of so-called white supremacy, if you will, certain tenets of misogyny, but en masse, Black men do not have a way to stop anyone from getting jobs, access to college degrees. They don't have any way to actually stop anybody from getting housing. And I would argue that most white people don't have that as well. You're looking at a systemic apparatus, a classism that's in place, but I digress. That's an argument that's been put out there, one, against black men, that's based off of a lot of erroneous information. But I think the reason why it's so popular to get online and bash black men and kind of call yourself an outside of the box thinker is that it really is no consequences. So if you make an entire platform, you're talking about the shortcomings in black men, you don't really stand to face any real consequences. You won't lose your job, you won't get blackballed, you won't be denied housing. There's nothing really of consequence. So what you can do as a content creator that uses their entire platform to disrespect black men and to use black men as the barometer for everything that's wrong in men, and call yourself a misandrist or call yourself being progressive, but really what you're doing is using a lot of the racist rhetoric and perspectives that have been honed from slave owners, people that enforce Jim Crow, people that have not had a good perspective of the black community. These ideas, this rhetoric, this perspective is coming from that source. It's coming from that point, but you can still use that and parrot that in your own way to act like you're a agent of change. You're trying to shape people's mentalities, but really it's a safe target. It's a target where you don't really have to worry about anything happening to you. And once again, as I called out the people that are the misogynists, as I called out the people that are red pill, as I've called out the people that practice the side of the gender wars where they want to blame everything on black women and that they're just doing nothing but promoting divisiveness, I have to say the exact same thing about black women that have platforms like this, that use their entire platform to do nothing but tear down black men. Because on these extremes, they are not looking for resolution. They are not looking to bridge the community and come together. What they are looking for is to build their platform, to monetize their toxic, counterproductive, idiotic, and racist rhetoric, and to get people to boost their echo chambers. And they kind of, echo each other's rhetoric, if you will. That's what the goal is. And like I said, I would be remiss if I could bring the misogynist to task, but I do not talk about a lot of women out here that have these platforms that are specifically aimed at black men. There's a content creator by the name of Cynthia G. A lot of her content is aimed at, it's just nothing but unadulterated, unfiltered, disgusting, toxic hatred of black men. And this is the content creator, I believe, allegedly, that said that if you're pregnant with a black male child, you should get an abortion. Allegedly. I'm not saying I saw that myself, but I've heard people say that. But I've for certain heard other people say that in personal settings. So what benefit or what utility does a platform like that have? If we're talking about the problem of the black community and black relationships and the fact that the black fertility rate is declining, it declined from 2018 and it's still declining now. If we're talking about all of these issues and how fragmented the community is, then how do any of these platforms help us? How do any of these platforms benefit us? When I study history, I have to look at someone like Marcus Garvey when I study history, and I have to look at the UNIA, and I have to look at people like Amy Jacks Garvey. I have to look at the Black Cross Nurses, which was a paramilitary unit within the UNIA. I have to look at people like Fannie Lou Hamer. I have to look at Nikki Giovanni. I have to look at James Baldwin. I have to look at Kwame Ture. I have to look at Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I have to look at Malcolm X. I have to look at Ida B. Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois. So many different men and women that came together to try to fix our problem, try to fix our community. Madam C.J. Walker, Maggie Walker, so many men and women. The true reformers that started in Richmond, Virginia, men and women working together. The Niagara movement, men and women that are working together. I could go on and on, but my point is, when you study our history and you study the great African-American heroes and activists that came and that really tried to work towards building a better future for black people, it was a collective of black men and women working together. And you don't find this rhetoric, which leads me to believe is this new gender war just another part of like some sort of COINTEL program? Because it really feels like what it's trying to encourage is a decline in birth rates. It seems like it's trying to discourage black men and women from forming families and coming together and having healthy relationships. I don't see anything productive that comes out from a platform that's advocating hatred of black women. I don't see anything productive that comes out of a platform that's advocating hatred of black men. All support should be taken away from all of those platforms, because this gender war, it seems to be the most embraced within the African American community, more so than any other group. It's counterproductive. It's still another form of racism, and nothing of substance will come from it, and it has to stop. This has been episode 89 of No Truths Barred. Make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel, which is the No Truths Barred podcast YouTube channel. Once again, thank you for tuning in to this episode, and I will be back with episode 90. Much love.